Okay, go.
This is Gina Wilkinson, and you're with the Break It Down Show.
That's right. You are with the Break It Down Show, and I'm working on fixing sound. So, Gina, I had a surprise for you, and it didn't work out, but I'm so excited about the surprise. I'm going to tell you about it anyhow, and I think you'll appreciate how cool this would have been if it would have worked out. So a buddy of mine is named Johnny Walker. He's probably the most famous interpreter from the Iraq-Afghan wars. He's written a best-selling book. He went on more SEAL missions than any SEAL in Iraq. So he lived this crazy warrior life and became, for sure, a marked man in Iraq for a number of reasons. And his wife, Beta, would move their family house to house to house, town to town, trying to stay ahead of the Istikharabat and all of these other people, the Al-Qaeda guys, all of these people that wanted to harm him and his family and everything else. She was going to join us and lend some like spousal Iraqi intrigue credibility to what we were doing, but she still isn't better from a surgery that she had recently, and so she can't join us. And so, dang it, I really wanted us to have this conversation. But no, so anyhow, so let's get back to you. So that was my regret. We'll talk about that in a second. But hey, everybody, this is Gina Wilkinson. She wrote this fantastic book right here, When the Apricots Bloom. And it's about, basically, it's a thriller set in Iraq, and she knows what she's talking about because she's been there. Hey, Gina, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Pete. How are you?
I am fantastic. It's a little bit warm in the tent here, but that's all right. I like it.
Great. Well, it's winter here in Australia where I am, so not warm at all.
Hey, so when I tell you that we almost had Johnny Walker's wife, Beta, on the show, what would that mean to you to have someone who lived the Iraqi wife life in terms of the book you've written? Because it's so like, that's exactly what you're writing about, are these homemakers and people who are trying to exist in a place where it's very hard to exist in a normal sense of the words.
Well, I'm sure the two of us would have a lot in common. Actually, the story leading up to me going to Iraq myself, I was actually living in Bangkok. I was a foreign correspondent there. My husband's Canadian, and he had followed me from Canada to Australia and then Australia to Thailand for my job. And then he was actually offered a job working for UNICEF in Iraq. And so when I went to Iraq, we agreed it was, time for him to have a shot at making a career. He'd sort of been following me around. The big fly in the ointment was that Saddam Hussein didn't allow foreign journalists to live in Iraq. So I went in as under a horribly named visa category. It's called the dependent spouse category. And I went into Iraq. I was the only foreign spouse living in Baghdad at that time, so I'm sure we'd have a lot in common. That feeling of isolation, but I've got to say, the Iraqi friends that I made there were wonderful. They're very, very warm people, and I think it's probably a different experience going in not a combat situation, going in as the wife of an aid worker versus the wife of someone in the military. You're going to be perceived differently, although my Iraqi friends actually are fairly open-minded and very friendly, so I'm sure they would have welcomed her, even if not the American military. So, I'm sure we'd have a lot of experiences that we could share. Also, I grew up moving around Australia as a kid. I had a dozen different schools. So I know what it's like. And I sort of continued that as an adult. I spent 20 years outside my homeland of Australia, working in various countries, including the US for a while. So I'm sure we would have a lot in common. That trying to keep your family together, especially after I had kids, it becomes, not just twice as difficult, I would say 10 times as difficult when you've got children involved and you're moving them from place to place. So I'm sure we'd have a lot in common. You
definitely related some of your story as I'm reading the book, and you talked about in the book in general, like, a lot of you is the main character. And so when you talk about this spousal visa and this, like, I need something to do, what does someone who's not allowed to be a foreign journalist do in real life on a day-to-day basis there on a spousal visa? And then again, like you said in the book over and over again, I'm going to say this over and over again, but you're not allowed to do everything that you want to do because it's not a Western place. It is I guess you would say it's a not a police state, but there's a lot of control over what's allowed and not allowed. And it'll get you in a lot of trouble real fast and look, instantly kicked out of the country. I mean, that happens all the time if you're allowed to leave. So talk about, what do you do?
Yeah, I would say, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which Saddam Hussein was in control for part of the time that I lived in Iraq. I was there for the last year of the rule of Saddam Hussein, in the first year, the start of the Iraq War. And it was a police state. You were very much controlled by the secret police, fear of the secret police, wondering if someone else was an informer, who you could trust. In fact, before I went into Iraq, I was given a security briefing, and I was told, my husband and I, the office will definitely be bugged. Your home will probably be bugged. Your phone, we weren't allowed to have mobile phones. Your house phone will definitely be bugged. And if you want to have a private conversation, go for a walk in the street where there's no power source to fuel hidden microphones. And so I really got my steps in Baghdad. I went for a lot of walks. Not that we had any sensitive secrets, but sometimes you just don't want people listening in on you. And, the story that I've written is actually based on real life, a very close friendship I had with someone who did turn out to be an informant for the secret police. So the story is partly told through the point of view of someone who is forced to be an informant for the secret police, and then through the eyes of two other women, one of whom is the diplomat's wife that she has to spy on. And a lot of people do say, oh, the diplomat's wife is you, but actually we have some big differences and some similarities. The character Ali, she was a journalist like me. She enters using this category of dependent spouse to try and get into Iraq. But unlike Ali, I actually didn't sit around the house for too long. I actually went out and got myself a job working for the United Nations Oil for Food program. I was a trainer there. I wasn't legally allowed to work, but I guess the regime didn't mind. They certainly knew I was doing it. So I did find myself a job. And I guess one of the other big differences between the two of us is that Ali is searching for information about her mother, who used to work in Iraq as a nurse back in the 60s and 70s. There were a lot of Western women working as nurses and teachers in Baghdad. It was a completely different place, very cosmopolitan. And Ali's searching for information about her mother, who died when she was very young. So I guess one of the big contrasts is I knew I was under surveillance. I didn't realize it was by one of my closest friends, but I was extremely careful not to go around poking into things that might get people in trouble. Not just me, I'd probably just get kicked out of the country, but anybody who was with me, any Iraqi, would suffer massive consequences, and I was very aware of that. So that's I guess one of the big differences is that I didn't go around before the war, poking my nose into things or going places that I shouldn't have gone, whereas the character of Ali does.
I think we need to slow down right here and talk about how dangerous a place a police state like Iraq can be, because you're saying that people are compelled to become informants. And, that's just the informant part. If someone informs on you, not you, but an Iraqi neighbor or whatever, it can be a real problem in that, all you got to do is say, this person doesn't have their Saddam picture up in the wall. You have to have a picture of Saddam on the wall in your house. And so that alone can cause attention to be brought to you. And now the wolf comes to your door because someone decides they've taken offense to anything that you've done. Even if you've done nothing, that offense can cause and bring a lot of attention. So let's talk a little bit about the danger. And by the way, LinkedIn is in trouble transmitting our show. So if you're watching on LinkedIn, watch on YouTube, youtube.com/Pete A. Turner. I don't know why LinkedIn's having trouble. I can't fix that, but I can send you over to YouTube where it sounds good. So let's talk about how dangerous that is and the intrigue that goes into that. Because I definitely, look, as a spy out there, we knew that we were exacting vendettas for people, and this was a normal thing, a normal way to get advantage, even like a financial advantage. Oh, we're competing for the same contract. I heard this guy has the opposite. Like, this guy has a statue to Saddam. He's a Baptist. Go get him, and then we go get him. Let's talk about danger.
Yeah, in the period under Saddam, I guess, he was such a huge influence on our daily lives. For example, even before I stepped out my front door, actually, I could see a huge billboard of Saddam Hussein outside my house. Ali has the same billboard outside her house. But I'd walk down the street, I'd come across multiple statues of Saddam Hussein, multiple murals, and there was actually a saying at the time that there was one statue or mural to look over every single person in Baghdad at the time, of which there were 5 million people. And, it really felt like that. Everywhere you turned, you saw Saddam Hussein's face. Yet at the same time, it was completely taboo to say his name out loud. People were that frightened of him. They were worried that if you said his name out loud, you would alert someone who might be an informer, you would activate a hidden microphone. So we lived this sort of strange existence where we couldn't talk about many of the things that were important to us. Many of the things that were worrying us, myself and the Iraqis, we couldn't talk about it until the very end, until the closing days. And when my friends finally started opening up and talking to me about Saddam Hussein, in the lead up to the war, I was like, right, it's happening now. There's no turning back. And there's quite a few scenes in the book that I used, that my Iraqi friends told me about. You mentioned, the photo of Saddam. There's actually a scene in the opening of my book where a secretary, the main character, Huda, she's working for a foreign embassy. She gets a knock on the door and she goes to answer it. But first, before she opens the door, she rearranges the photos that she has displayed on the wall there. And one of them is a picture of Saddam Hussein and it's facing the wall. And before she opens the door, she turns it around so it's got a prominent position and it's facing the right way. That was actually told to me by one of my friend's mothers. She did the same thing. She kept a photo of Saddam Hussein by the door. In case someone knocked, she'd turn it around. Another friend of mine kept a Saddam Hussein watch in the car. And, whenever he got to a checkpoint, he'd open his glove box and put on the Saddam Hussein watch. Another friend had used a code name for him inside her own house when she was talking about Saddam Hussein. Her husband and her would refer to him as the brown cow. No connection there that I can make, and that's probably the reason, because they, even in front of your own children, especially, you had to be careful what you said because teachers were obliged to report anything they heard that might be interpreted as disloyal. It was a very sort of stressful situation, that the not knowing, I guess, and that fear of not knowing who you can trust is, of course, one of the most potent weapons. The feeling that you're alone, that you don't have people that you can trust, is a very effective way to keep a large number of people under control. And certainly, Saddam Hussein and his cronies would regularly, mete out terrible punishments, and make these punishments very public to warn people off. His son, Uday Hussein, was even more of, a crazy, murderous maniac. So, there was always that feeling that you had to toe the line, that constant fear also of not knowing who to trust. I think, dividing people, the divide and conquer, it's still being used, to great effect.
We don't have to get into this too far, but a lot of people are using this kind of state of mind, state of a country, to represent the COVID crisis. I know you guys are going through your stuff specifically there, and it's ramped up and elevated as we all try to get this global pandemic under control. Here in the U.S., we can't stop fighting about it. How much control and everything else. But you've lived in a place where the police will come knock on your door, and that might be the end of someone's life in your house. So does this in any way to you, and I don't want to answer for you, and if you don't want to answer, just say I don't want to answer that crap, Pete, but does this in any way equate to what we're experiencing here in the United States and Australia in terms of a police state and control by the government?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. No. One seems like good medical advice. And, the thing that actually I see the parallels with is misinformation. That's what I see the parallels with. Saddam Hussein controlled you couldn't get foreign television. You couldn't get outside newspapers. You couldn't get outside radio. You could only get Saddam television, Saddam newspapers. So you only, got his crazy conspiracies. And there's so much misinformation out there now. And I think that actually, that use of misinformation for political purposes, there's a parallel that I see, in what's happening around the world with COVID, people using people's fear of the virus for political purposes. Feeding lies, getting also people to divide into camps. That is another, tactic that that people use. Saddam Hussein divided the Shia and the Sunni, or tried to, divide people along religious lines, along ethnic lines. I got to say, in Baghdad, I didn't see that. I knew lots of Shia married to Sunnis, married, Kurds who were best friends with Shia or Sunnis. But that was Baghdad, so I guess that's a bit more of a melting pot. But that division of people is something that we see happening now all around us. So yeah, definitely, I guess those are the parallels that I see. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you answering that, because that's not an easy thing to talk about, because it is happening right now. But it does, I think, give us all a sense of what it's like to live in a dictator's regime, which is what you did. And then you try to say, well, it's like here in America, we're like, everything's a Nazi. Anything I don't like is a Nazi. It's like, no, actually, it's not a Nazi. It's not even close. Nazis are a completely different animal than us all having the ability to vote for whoever we want. Let's get off of that topic, though. But let's for sure talk about Iraq. One of the things that I learned from the Iraqis was they have this sense of their Western openness, and they always talk about it. You mentioned it in the book, and that's why it triggered a memory in me. Everybody talks about how women used to wear miniskirts and go to clubs, and the Karata Peninsula had discos everywhere. And you might even see someone water skiing on the Tigris River or the Euphrates and all these things. But then they run out of things to say. It's almost as if they have talking points when they talk about how Western they were, because they always say the same things. So, yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, actually, one of my friends did used to go water skiing on the Tigris, strangely enough. And some of my friends did wear mini skirts.
They really taught me this.
Yeah. And in fact, in my book, I talk a lot about that period. It's a period called the Golden Years. That's what the Iraqis refer to it. It's the late 60s, early 70s, when, Baghdad was an extremely cosmopolitan place. You had a lot of expats living there from America, working in the oil industry, a lot of foreign women working as nurses and teachers, a lot of tourists coming from Europe. There were casinos, there were nightclubs. Everything was going up. The country was prosperous, and Saddam Hussein eventually came to power at the tail end of that. And after that, things went down. The war with Iran started, a huge, massively costly in terms of lives, in terms of resources. And then there was just this never-ending cycle of conflict. And, Iraqis are very proud people. And I often found that they did refer, they had a hard time, I guess, because they were so patriotic, on giving up on the dream of the golden years. That's what they were holding on to, that hope that somehow they could get back to the golden years. And I remember once a friend invited me to go and meet her at this restaurant on the riverside. It was just on the edge of Baghdad. And I use this actually often as a setting in the book. I have a few scenes there. And she said, oh, it's very popular. And we got there for lunch, and we were the only people there. And I suddenly realized, oh, she means popular once upon a time, so they had a very hard time letting go of the past. And I guess that's one way to also survive what you're going through. If you lose hope and say this is all we're getting, then that's it. But many of my friends were, I guess, quite Western. They spoke multiple languages fluently. Many of them studied overseas before the country got, cut off from the outside world. They were fairly, secular, not religious. In fact, Saddam Hussein himself was very secular and not religious at all, until it suited his purposes to change his mind. And one of the big things was the treatment of women. At one point, women under Saddam Hussein had much greater rights than any other women in the Middle East. In fact, Saddam Hussein, he was a terrible human rights abuser, but he was an equal opportunity abuser. He had women in very high-ranking positions in his government. Women drove themselves. They didn't wear a headscarf. This is when I was there. We had women engineers, doctors, influential positions in society. And, since the fall of Saddam, that has really turned and gone in the opposite direction. So that's one of those unintended consequences, of conflict. Women, we're seeing, this again playing out in Afghanistan, women getting the, losing out on these hard-won rights that they've fought for. It's a real shame, and that's also something that I wanted to look at in the book. Look at places under stress, and an environment under stress from a female point of view, because so often you see it from a male point of view, like somebody in the military or somebody who was, a contractor. It's often men telling these stories in conflict zones. And so I deliberately tried not to, have explosions, car crashes, this sort of stuff. And, some of the scariest scenes that I consider the scariest scenes in the book, one of them takes place in Huda's kitchen, as she's trying to cook her son his favorite meal. Another takes place at a popular picnic spot, and another one takes place at an ice cream parlor. And, I deliberately tried to keep it away from what you normally hear when men are telling the story, and look at it through women's eyes. Because it was interesting when we're talking about, clinging to that past, the golden years, I often found that my male Iraqi friends were much less flexible in terms of thinking, what am I going to do about the future? And my female Iraqi friends were already making plans. One of the big areas of conflict between my Iraqi friends, husbands and wives, in the lead up to the war was women wanted to make plans about, what do we do? Let's go to the country. Let's find somewhere to flee. Let's take our kids. And the men were like, no, we're not going anywhere. We're staying here. Women, under the sanctions, so many people lost their jobs, and women were more prepared to take on other work. For example, one of my good friends is a highly trained engineer, and then she got herself a job as a secretary and eventually worked herself up to be a program manager working for UNICEF. Whereas a lot of the men, they were economists or whatever, and they weren't prepared to say, oh, well, I'm going to take a lower ranking job. So it seemed to me that many of my Iraqi female friends were looking towards the future and were trying to work out how to navigate a very difficult present, whereas many of my male friends were more focused on that past and how do we regain that past? How do we get back to what we had?
When I was reading the book, it was fun because of my job as a counterintelligence guy, I got to run around a lot of Iraq, especially eastern side of Baghdad, and would find myself in the locations that you were talking about, Abu Nawas, all the different hotels. I've been to all of them, and I would get to go out to all these places like, oh, you should have seen this place back in the olden times. The Semich Maskouf here. Oh, it's so good. And the guy would be like, can I make you a Semich Maskouf? And the answer to that question is always, yes, of course, let's do it. Let's have this wonderful thing. Let you, have this moment and tell me about your incredible place, because that opens up mouths and minds and everything. And I think about like my particular approach to spying. And then I think about these leather jacketed thugs for Saddam's police. And I think, why wouldn't you, look, there are different ways of doing this stuff, but I am the most subtle and visible. Like, you are bursting to tell me things by the time I'm done, because I'm just fascinated by what it is that you're doing. That's how I approach this thing. How did you get to figure out what these secret police guys were like? What was that learning process for you?
Well, there were the guys in the leather jackets that you're referring to. I think of them more as deterrence or security. They were very visible, and it didn't take long to work out who they were and what they were there for. They were to make sure they were there to instill fear and to maintain a presence, to make you know that they were watching. And there were other people that were more like you. They weren't there to let you know they were watching. They might be your best friend. And, in my case, I had my suspicions that my friend was something was not on the up and up. In fact, I was more suspicious about her husband, but I think she was probably the brains behind the operation. I eventually did find out because after the war, other Iraqis who were working with her outed her. And she came to me and told me she'd lost her job. And then I investigated further and, had my fears confirmed. And, also I've got to say, I don't blame her for being an informant. Not at all. She came from a pretty humble background. She had, her family had suffered a lot. In fact, 2 of her brothers had been executed by the regime in the uprising in the Gulf War. And so when they came to her, this is well before my time, I imagine, and told her, we want you to inform for us. I don't feel that she was really in a position to say no. So when I started writing my book, I tried to imagine, what would it have been like for someone like her the first time that the secret police came knocking at her, at someone's door and said, you have to do this for us or else we're going to conscript your son into Uday's militia. That's how the book starts. But, quite ordinary people got caught up in this. And, some people perhaps could resist if you had a lot of influence, a lot of connections with the aristocratic, families of the past. Maybe you could resist to some extent. But, Saddam Hussein was very good at knowing what you would fear most and using your family against you, threatening to hurt your wife or your children. I mean, that is a huge, who can say no, really? And that was one thing I wanted to look at in this book, was make people think, gee, when I tell people, oh, one of my best friends was an informant, usually their first reaction is, oh my gosh, what a terrible person. But, I think if you read this book at the end, you're going to be thinking, well, I probably would have done exactly the same thing. And, I think I probably, in her circumstances, would have done exactly the same thing. Well, maybe not in the same way, but, that's a very powerful tool. Pressure tactic is to use the safety of your family. You don't have much maneuvering room there, and in somewhere like Iraq, they'll follow through on it.
That influence, an Iraqi word for influence, and if you don't have a lot of influence, you really are left to your own devices. Maybe your tribe has influence, but probably not in most cases, because the tribal system doesn't work like that. You don't get influence from them. You deal with certain things, and that's about it. And you're 100% right. You're trying to survive, and this is a dangerous place, especially for the Iraqis. Less dangerous for you because they'll just kick you out, but they're most likely not going to assassinate you or whatever. So these things are things that we don't understand because we come from this stable Western world. I wanted to go back to the secular, non-secular nature of Iraq as well too, because you're 100% right. I would hear this all the time, like, hey, we didn't care that much about religion before you guys got here. This is all because of the war. And it's primarily, get this is mostly, I know you probably know this, but for everybody listening, like my buddy Tom, the religion aspect, the Sunni Shia part of it was primarily political. It's political party based. It's not based on which kind of Jesus you worship and everything. It's like, how do you get influence? How do you get more when there's not enough for anybody? Because all of it's up top. And then you have to sprinkle in all this intrigue. There's intrigue everywhere. Someone's always, and you're so right about this. It was one of the problems that we had in stabilizing the country. And I would write about this all the time because the specter of the danger was massive compared to the reality. Around every corner is jam. Around every corner is this. And we fed into that because the American army, at least, is so focused on threat, so focused on where the next bomb is coming from. We don't see that, like, 300 plus days out of the year in Iraq, there's no bomb. But there are a number of days, but we look every day like, oh my God, there's a bomb. Oh my God, there's a bomb. And so we feed into this crazed sense of a lack of security. And the Iraqis were all too glad to play along with that, because that really is how they live their life. What's around the corner? Who's talking about me? And this turns into abuse. I talked to an Iraqi dad who said, we were talking about freedom, and he was giving me his example of freedom. And then he talked about how he beat his daughter because she was on the roof too long. because by being on the roof too long, that makes her a whore. That means he's not doing his job, and that means here comes trouble from other people.
Yeah, but I guess in a way, I had, most of my Iraqi friends were fairly well-educated Baghdadis, and the women I know had a lot of power in their personal relationships with there's actually, the word for housewife in Arabic is goddess of the house. And, they did have a lot of power, and, they were independent women with their own careers and their own minds. But, if you look at other more traditional sectors of Iraq, there still was a lot of that, repression of women's rights. And, I feel like that has really, rolled back. And that's one of the chips that Saddam Hussein used to bargain with in the lead up to the Iraq war. He knew he had to shore up his own personal or political power. And so he traded off women's rights to, religious extremists, to groups that did want to suppress women. So they were used as a bargaining chip. And I actually, show that in my book when Huda and her friend Rania, who is an Iraqi artist, are trying to get passports to get their kids out of the country. They call an old contact in the opposition, the secular opposition. And it turns out in the years that they haven't been in contact with him, he's teamed up with a cleric who wants to, limit women's rights. So, that is one of, I think, of the great tragedies of the Iraq War. And what happened afterwards was, that loss of women's ability to, create their, chart their own futures. And in fact, that was, the turning point for some of my Iraqi friends when they eventually did leave Iraq. One of my friends, I remember she told me that the final straw for her was when her husband said, "I don't want you going outside anymore without a headscarf on." Not that he believed she should wear a headscarf, but he was frightened what would happen to her if she went out of the house without a headscarf on. That for her, especially she has daughters, was the final straw that broke the camel's back, I guess. So I think, in this book, you can see that process starting.
Yeah, that was on mute. But that is so true what you're talking about. You don't want to be the nailhead that sticks up the highest because it gets cut or stomped, that kind of thing. And even if you have the word I was going to use earlier is called wasta, right? If you have wasta, you have influence in the area that you're in. There's no amount of wasta if you're a tall nail. You're going to get hit at some point somewhere in your area because they want to bring you back to the fold. They're just like this. They claw you back to the middle, to the misery. So you can't pay your money too much. And I'm talking about Iraq in general, not just about Baghdad, but in Baghdad, I mean, there are neighborhoods and you could see like all the homes had to be built very similarly. There was very little difference, even if they had a lot of money, because you had to fit into the norm. Otherwise, someone might alert Saddam about your whatever and make it up, have it be completely fanciful. I want to get back to the story and the fact of using women as your storytellers. And I love that. I mean, it's too often it's like, here comes the one American who's going to save the day for all the dumb Aussies or whatever, right? Like we have this trope and I'm frankly sick of seeing it. We got to get better at telling stories. And so having this early connection between these two women and having it come back and having this, obviously there's some hidden strife and just the way you tell the story from a more, and I say this with all the respect because I don't know if I can explain it very good, but the feminine point of view of things. When you walk into a room, women have a different view of that room. When you get pulled into the back by some secret police and you're a woman, you've got a different experience than the dude has. And it's great to see that point of view. Thank you for writing that. Did you, As you're trying to sort this stuff out, I know you know how to write because you're a reporter, but how do you sort out the actual fiction part of it and make the hone the wood into this path that makes sense? Because the story's well written. I mean, it makes sense. There's not big leaps that you're asking me to make. There's always this undertone of intrigue and danger and everything. You do a great job of sewing that in. Talk about that.
Well, it was interesting. I found I actually had to, journalism is great. It's been a help for me in a way because it's taught me to pay attention to detail. I know how to research things. I know how to make contacts. I know how to ask questions. It gave me the ability to go places and ask questions that I would never normally get the opportunity to ask or to visit. But when I was writing this book, I actually had to train myself not to rely purely on the facts. Because, I often think, oh, wow, this is the perfect opportunity for me to put in this bit that happened in my real life. And then I'd write it down and I'd look at it and I'd think, you know what? Nobody is going to believe that. No one's going to think that's possible. And I think it actually is true that fact is stranger than fiction. Because in life, things happen out of the blue. Things happen that you wouldn't expect. People who behave out of character, for example, you can have someone who's highly ethical under great stress. They might do something you would never expect them to do. Even they would never expect themselves to do. So people, fall down unexpectedly, let themselves down. You have people who could be very meek, suddenly turn completely courageous on a dime. And you can't have that happen in a novel. Your characters, you at least have to plant the clues going along. So there were often cases where I thought, you know what, that real life thing just seems unbelievable. So I'm going to have to edit that out. And there's a great saying, it is, fiction is the lie that reveals the truth. And I think that's what I had to teach myself to do, to look at the bigger picture, to think, don't rely on your own experience. What else could happen in this situation? And I think for novelists, we are looking for, well, at least I know this is my case, but, I was looking for the answers that I didn't get in my real life, to explore the issues that perhaps I wasn't brave enough to explore at the time, wasn't willing to explore at the time, and, look for that truth that's buried underneath the chaos and unpredictability of our everyday existence. So I think, that was, my challenge moving from being a journalist to a novelist was letting go of, just the small facts and looking at the larger truth and how do I get there? That was I guess my real challenge.
I don't want to get too much into the book because I want everybody to buy it. By the way, everybody look. It's called "When the Apricots Bloom," and it's a story of Iraqi intrigue. It's so good. You guys will absolutely love it. I promise. If you like any kind of thriller type things, I definitely recommend it. There's a link there on the page. There'll be a link in the show notes. Definitely check all that stuff out. If you're new to the show, hey, would you subscribe? Be really helpful. We do great stuff like this all the time. I wanted to get back into Huda because she's this heroine, right? And she's terrified. She doesn't want to be a heroine. And she's also, I'm going to be unfair, but she's saddled with this husband who's a broken man because of how life has proceeded. But he's also a proud Iraqi man. And so there's this cultural stuff. And so she's got to kind of yank this stubborn donkey along on life's journey until he can either get it figured out or whatever's going to happen. But this is a unique thing. Like, we typically don't see the damaged partner in the male victory story, right? But we have this thing in yours, and it's so powerful because in this context, it's very hard for a man in Iraq to be reborn like this. They've been broken. They've almost been cast down a couple layers, and it's really hard within your tribe, within your neighborhood, to rebuild a life, especially if you were like, I bought into the dream. I'm going to be, I can't tell you how many engineers and doctors I met who were glad to sweep the floor and just knew that their lives would never be any better than that. They'd completely been defeated.
Yeah, I think we were discussing this a little bit before about that flexibility. Iraq suffered through the Iran-Iraq war, then the Gulf War, international sanctions, and women general, I found were more flexible about thinking about alternative paths for themselves. What other jobs can I do apart from being an engineer? How am I going to navigate this situation? Whereas, often men had a very hard time giving up on that dream, taking a lower status job. But also it is true that, their prospects were hugely damaged. There was, when I arrived there under international sanctions, there was no economic activity. It was just the bare bones. The UN Oil for Food program was supplying people with food. So, there was very little economic activity, and Iraqis are a very proud race. They're very patriotic, especially the guys. And so I think it was harder for them to be more flexible. I guess they had also, many years of pressure and expectation on them about what, their need to achieve, their need to provide for their family, to be a success, I guess. And there were so many years leading up, the golden years, everyone was on track to be a success. And it was hard for the men to be more flexible, not all of them, of course, as, a bit of a generalization. But, it was definitely a difficult, adjustment, more than an adjustment, a seismic cataclysm that just kept happening and happening. And I guess in a way, I also found this as a journalist, as a woman journalist, I would often find that men, especially powerful men, would give me interviews, and they wouldn't give other colleagues male interviews because male colleagues interviews because they thought I'd give them the softballs, that I wouldn't ask the hard questions, and they were wrong, and so perhaps that also was at play, that women were able to navigate without being seen so much as a threat, as something to be, hammered down, as you mentioned. Perhaps they were able to move more freely without attracting attention from the power brokers. That's also another possibility.
Yeah, it's fascinating. What do you love about Iraqi culture?
Oh, right. Well, they've got a good sense of humor. I would say Australians are quite sarcastic. We have like an ironic sense of humor, and so do Iraqis. One of the things actually that I love when I went into Iraq, I had, almost no idea what I was heading into. I contacted the UN and I'm like, what should I expect? And they're like, just wait till you get here. And I was a journalist. I was used to doing a lot of research, but it had been cut off from the world for so long. I could find nothing about, what is Baghdad like today? And one of the things that I really was just so glad to discover, that when I got there was more than 24 independent art galleries operating in Baghdad at that time. And I ended up spending a lot of my free time in art galleries. I've made a lot of friends in the artistic community, and there's a third narrator in my story, and she's an artist. This, is where this plays out, because I also wanted to show some of the lovely aspects of Iraqi culture, not just the oppression and the fear and the suspicion. And, artists have always been respected in Iraq. We're talking going back millennia. They've always been this sort of conduits that connect the outside world and the inner part of Iraqi society. And that was still the case. And they were very respected members of society. And because artists had for so long operated in that space where they sort of had this contact with the outside world, they were these connectors, I was able to meet my friends at art galleries and not attract the same sort of scrutiny that we would have if we'd met in other places. Because in general, my Iraqi friends did not want to be seen with me in public because they were worried that, that would draw the attraction of draw the eye of the secret police and bring trouble down on them. But, art galleries were one of the few places that I could go and meet with my friends, and we could have, a less stressful time, feel that we could talk perhaps a little bit more freely. And of course, you can see on a canvas any sort of message that you want to interpret, so that was, a place, a space that I really enjoyed. occupying in Iraq, going to the art galleries, appreciating the amazing Iraqi art, any sort of art you wanted, classical art, modern art, sculpture, painting, all different forms. It was there, and that for me was a real a lifesaver. The ability to go to these art galleries, to meet with people, and not have quite as much of that feeling that Big Brother was watching you.
Do you find that Baghdad calls to you and pulls you back towards it? Would you go? Like if I've got a project, but I need someone to go be a reporter, would you want to go?
Yeah, I'd have to review the security situation. I guess now I have children, so I am more conscious of, if something happened to me, who's going to take care of them? I do have a husband, but still, I still worry about the impact on my kids. But, I stay in contact with my Iraqi friends. It's been like almost 20 years. We're still in touch. I would love to go back to Iraq. When I was living in Southeast Asia, I would often run into Vietnam vets who had come back, and I guess, that's probably true for many Americans and allies who've served in the Middle East as well. There's a feeling of unfinished business. You want to go and, revisit places that are dear to you, to close the circle. Those questions aren't always possible to answer. Sometimes you might find answers you didn't think you were going to find, that you didn't want to find. But there is always that drive to go back, especially I think when you've suffered a great loss. In my own life, I mentioned I worked for the UN. Some of your listeners and viewers might remember in the early days of the war, the UN headquarters was destroyed in a suicide bombing. My closest friend died in that, 21 of my other colleagues. And, many of my close friends from Iraq have died and been killed. And, when you carry that trauma with you, you often feel that if you can revisit that place, maybe somehow it will be alleviated. So I think, you do leave a part of yourself. And, I remember when I was standing outside the UN and it was on fire, after I learned that my close friend had died, and when I was eventually leaving the scene, I remember stopping, and it was so noisy. It was so hot. One thing I always was shocked every time it happened, when I went to a suicide bombing, was the noise. The noise is so loud. Everything was always so loud. Maybe it's because your senses are heightened. Everything is hotter. Everything is louder. And I remember feeling like a piece of myself was falling into that sand, and I was never going to get it out of there, that it was just tunneling down, down, down. And, I imagine a lot of people who've been in conflict and suffer some sort of loss, they feel that a part of themselves is left behind.
Yeah, for sure. We had a suicide bomber drive up to the camp that we worked on, and literally on the other side of the concrete wall. So we're as safe as can be in terms of a bomb going off, but a bomb does go off 30 feet from our front door of our office, and pieces of the dude in the car rain down in our area. And life is a little clearer in those moments. You see things a little better, a little crisper. You smell more. You can hear everything. And then, slowly you go back to having a regular life. But there is something that's taken from you every time that happens. I mean, you realize just how temporary life can be. And you look at the sky and you look around, you're like, I'm still here. Now what? And that's kind of how I've experienced those things. There are a lot of ghosts in Iraq. I'm always struck by this. And we always kind of have our favorite ghost, like us combat guys. We love T.E. Lawrence. We'll talk about T.E. We won't study him much, but we'll talk about T.E. Lawrence. For sure, there are the Iraqi poets and all of the different artists. And if you want to become worldly, start studying those guys. Anybody listening to the audience, oh my God, get into Iraqi poetry and you will have a whole new world open to you. And you can't learn enough about it. You just can't, because someone's always going to be ahead of you, and you can just read more and more and more. It is fascinating. But who were your Iraqi ghosts? I'm gonna ask about Gertrude Bell if you have any specific memories of her, because she should resonate with you. But who are your Iraqi ghosts?
Yeah, Gertrude Bell, Freya Stark, I guess, if we're talking Westerners. But
Yeah.
actually, poetry. One of my favorite poets. He spent a lot of time in Iraq. I'm not sure if he was born in Iraq or Syria. Is Rumi, and
Okay.
he is an amazing poet. And I'm just looking here. If 1 minute, just excuse me,
Yeah,
1 minute. This is the magic of
please.
television.
I'll grant for
uh,
you while she reaches over and
okay.
grabs it for it.
Um,
Yes.
this is the British version, the British cover for When the Apricots Bloom. They asked me if I wanted to put an inscription. Actually, I put one from Rumi, and it is:
Nice.
"The truth was a mirror in the hands of God. It fell and broke into pieces. Everybody took a piece of it, and they looked at it and thought they had the truth." Which I think is, so
Yeah.
true even today. There's a mirror, it's fallen into pieces. We each grab our own and we say, oh, this is the real, the
Yeah.
real reflection, the real truth. So yeah, Rumi has a lot, to say about life, about loss. And, I guess in Iraq, Abu Nawaz was
Sure.
everywhere. He's another great, Iraqi poet and I guess bon vivant. He was everywhere, and she's not quite a ghost. I guess she's a fictional character, but Scheherazade. Scheherazade is the narrator of the 1001 Nights of the Arabian Nights. People know the individual stories, Ali Baba, Sinbad, and so on, but in the original document, it was all told by a woman called Scheherazade, and she had been sold off to a sultan. He was a man with an inferiority complex because he married 1,000 women and he beheaded each of them in the morning after the wedding night, because he was afraid that they'd cheat on him. So he kept his wife only for one night and then got a new one. And Scheherazade's trick to stay alive was she started telling these stories, but just as she got to the the climax, she'd say, "Okay, I'll tell you the ending tomorrow morning." And so he'd keep her alive, wanting to hear the end of the story. And so this is all set in Baghdad. He's a sultan of Baghdad. And she was, telling stories to stay alive, which was very much like the characters in my novel. And one thing that I loved, when I walked around Baghdad and there were so many statues of Saddam Hussein everywhere, there was one statue that, avoided being razed to the ground by him, and that was a statue of Scheherazade right on the river telling her stories. So she, for me, was another, ghost that you would find in Baghdad. And some of the other women that appeared in the 1001 Nights were also there. The maid that fills the boiling, provides Ali with the boiling oil to seal his robbers in their tomb. They were there. So they were like ghosts, these ghosts of times past, and women who used their brains, I guess, to outwit the oppressors of the time.
Hey, what's next for you? I mean, this book is awesome. Again, everybody should get it. It's When the Apricots Bloom. There it is. Get it on Amazon. The link's right there on the page. It'll be in the show notes. But what's next for you?
Yeah, well, I'm really hoping it'll be the end of homeschooling, because it is so hard to be a creative when you've got two kids that need constant supervision to do their schoolwork. So I'm really, praying for a return to school. But I'm looking at a couple different stories that I'm playing around with at the moment. When I lived in the States for 6 years. I spent in Washington, D.C. and a couple years in New York. And actually, when I was in D.C., I lived in Maryland. And I quite often visited Frederick, which is near the border with West Virginia and Maryland, the site of many, great Civil War battles. And I was thinking about a novel set in that part of the world. I remember going to a museum there and seeing photographs of taken by the first war photojournalist. And that was, really left an impression on me. And when you walk around in those areas hiking, it's beautiful country. You're near the Appalachian Trail. You can come across remnants from the Civil War there. You might find an old bullet. You might find some other debris or remnant from that time. And I was looking at a story of a nurse who comes back from working in a lot of hot spots back to this town, and that's the setting. And the other setting actually also involves, I guess, the question of who is a terrorist and who's not a terrorist in Australia. I guess in the States, I found the military were your national heroes. Very much, if you go to the football, there's the military are really the heroes of America. In Australia, it's more the farmers. Farmers are symbols in the same way that the military is in the States. And when I actually grew up in the country, and in the 1980s, it was a period of very high inflation, at 20%, I think, per annum. A lot of farmers were getting forced off their land. And I was just starting off in the late 80s. I was a student journalist, and I managed to find a contact in a group called the Rural Rebel Farmers Movement. It was this group of farmers that actually banded together and were kidnapping bank managers, threatening to blow up banks, stuff like that. And I'm thinking about setting something in that period, looking at that, that group of people, that situation, how it came to pass. And another reason I was thinking about that, it's in the 80s. It is pre-mobile phone, because I tell you, the mobile phone is a real killer when you're writing a thriller or a suspense novel. When you can Google your way out of it, you can use your GPS. It's a disaster for thrillers. So I was a teenager in the 80s, so I guess that also appeals to me. So I'm looking at something set in the 80s, pre-mobile phone, and I guess there's those elements of conflict, whether it be civil war, more domestic conflict, I guess. And I think that a lot of those farmers at the time in Australia were feeling a lot of emotions that people are feeling now in America, and across the world, with the change in the way the economy's operating, feeling disenfranchised, I guess, wondering about their place. So I think there's a lot of symmetry, there.
That makes a lot of sense. We got like another minute or two. Do you want to ask me a question, given our common background in Iraq?
Yeah, well, I guess I would ask you, what did you enjoy about Iraq? What was the most surprising thing you learned about Iraqi culture?
One of the things I got to do as a counterintelligence person, right, was to go out and challenge the norms of what we thought Iraq and Iraqis were. And I love telling this story, but I think it just nails it. Iraqis are telling me every day, we're not religious. Yeah. We believe in God and all that, but we just don't care. We just don't, it's not our thing. And so you'd write this and people didn't get how important this was. And we were absolutely convinced this is sectarian violence. Like, well, you know what? It's political violence. No, it's not. Like, all right, well, let's work on this then. Let's work on what the reality is. So I would study this and I would ask questions about it. And so it was Ramadan, and we're always deathly afraid of offending anybody. And I'd learned to avoid that. The Iraqis taught me to, like, we know you're an American. We know you're a Christian. We know that you do things differently. So it doesn't matter if these things are true or not. That's their truth for me. And so it's okay if you eat with your left hand. It's okay if you drink water during Ramadan. So I see this colonel and I'm talking to him, and I'm with the boss. I'm with my commander. And I say to him, hey, I got questions about Ramadan. Can I ask you some questions? And then everybody gets nervous. This is silly. And so I say to the guy, I'm like, one of the things we're worried about is like just drinking water in front of you during Ramadan because you're going through the struggle and all that stuff, or having lunch or whatever. Like, what's the real scoop on this? And he's like, I have a bottle of whiskey in my desk right now. And if you're willing to, I'll have a drink with you right now. This is Ramadan, And so he broke out his whiskey bottle and we had shots and we drank and we laughed. And it was a totally different vibe after that with that guy because we were just less uptight. And what I learned from Iraqis is like everybody, they want to be allowed to be great hosts. They want to show you how great their food is and how wonderful their wife can cook. And if you just let them, They will blow you away with their generosity and their stories and their culture. You can't know everything about a place you go to, especially in Iraq. There's no way. Look, Timothy McIntosh Smith wrote this fantastic 3,000-year history of the Arabs. It will blow you away with how insignificant your knowledge of history is after you read that, because the Arabs have been writing things down for 3,000 years. And so I just loved hearing all of this stuff from these folks who were desperate to get their country back, and just full of love and family and food and all the things you might expect of any culture. That's what I really pulled out of it, was that these folks are regular folks, and they're not as hardcore as you want them to be. They're just good people.
Yeah, that's very true. And, that was one thing that I was hoping people would get out of my book too, was, the similarities. We might bake our bread in a slightly different way. We might pray in a slightly different way. But, at the heart of things, and I think this is true not just for Iraq, but all around the world, people want the same things. They want safety. They want the ability to have some personal freedoms. They want love, family. This is not a unique thing to the Western world. It's not a unique thing to the Arab world. There's so many important things that we share. And, at the moment, I feel people are so divided and focused on the things that we don't share. And it would be great to get back to having more of a focus on the things that we do share. So fingers crossed for that.
I love that. All right, let me wrap this thing up. Stand by. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank